In 1863, there was no cure for someone infected with the smallpox virus. Treatment consisted of keeping the patient as comfortable as possible and hoping for the best. All Union and Confederate soldiers were required to be vaccinated, but in many cases, especially among Southerners, the vaccinations were not effective. During the Antietam campaign in 1862, thousands of Confederate soldiers were deemed unfit for duty because of smallpox. The first cases of smallpox at the Rock Island prison were reported on December 6, 1863, 3 days after the prisoners arrived and 11 days after they were captured. A person infected with smallpox will not show any signs of the disease for about 12 to 14 days. Clearly, some of the Confederate prisoners had been infected before the battle. Benton McAdams wrote, "When the prisoners arrived, they found the place unprepared for any sickness, let alone anything as virulent as smallpox. Without a hospital, Colonel Johnson ordered 6 of the new barracks set aside to quarantine the 800 infected prisoners." The suffering that winter was severe. But by the end of April 1864, the epidemic at Rock Island had run its course. New sanitation sinks had been dug, a hospital had been built, and all prisoners and guards vaccinated. In the previous 4 months, almost 900 prisoners and 34 guards had died from smallpox and other diseases. Never again would the Rock Island prison see such casualties. In 1863, the country was divided not just between North and South, but also within cities, especially in Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The citizens of Rock Island were divided between those who favored the abolition of slavery and those who opposed abolition and called for an immediate end to the war and reconciliation with the South. Many Southern sympathizers were called Copperheads, in reference to the venomous copperhead snake. The Copperheads themselves embraced the name and eventually used the Liberty Head penny as a secret identification device. These copperhead symbols would be pinned on the underside of lapels and only shown among friends or at meetings. In Rock Island, the Copperhead clause was championed by J.B. Danforth, the owner and editor of the Rock Island Argus. Lincoln supporters read the Rock Island Union, which had been purchased in 1863 by Myron Barnes, the former colonel of the 37th Illinois Infantry. The 2 newspapers and the 2 editors quickly showed their animosity toward one another. A continuing source of conflict between the 2 newspapers was the Rock Island prison and the treatment of the prisoners. Danforth of the Argus wrote in early January 1864 that the mortality rate among the Confederate prisoners on the island was higher than that of the Union prisoners being held in Richmond, Virginia. A copy of the article was forwarded to the authorities in Washington, D.C. The Surgeon General promptly dispatched an inspector, Norton Townshend, to the island to investigate. Townshend reported that the statements in the paper were greatly exaggerated, while at the same time downplaying some of the real problems. Danforth had some legitimate concerns about conditions at Rock Island in the winter of 1864, when the death rate was quite high. However, after conditions had improved, he continued to vilify the Union officers stationed on the island and reported on the alleged mistreatment of Confederate prisoners and the conditions in which they lived. On November 21st of 1864, Danforth wrote,
"The prisoners are kept on too short fare. In fact, they are starved down to barely a living point. Under this scanty, unsuitable fare, they are fast filling the graveyards."
2 days later, Colonel Johnson, commandant of the Rock Island prison, fired off a response to the editor of the Argus in which he correctly pointed out that the bread and meat rations for the Confederate prisoners were only 2 ounces a day less than for soldiers serving in the Union Army at this time. Johnson also wrote that of the over 6,000 prisoners incarcerated on the island the previous week, there were only 3 deaths from all causes, a figure, in fact, printed in Danforth's own Argus. Danforth was a constant source of exaggerated allegations about the Rock Island prison, which would reappear in articles 50 or even 100 years later and taken as confirmed truths. After smallpox had been brought under control and the hospital built, life at Rock Island Prison, for most prisoners, settled into a routine. To pass the time, some prisoners made money by working to help build a new prison water reservoir and sewer system, or, for the literate, through employment as clerks in Commandant Johnson's office. The pay was 5 or 10 cents a day. They could also make trinkets to sell, as described in a letter home from prisoner James B. Drake.
The boys here spend their time making rings, breastpins, all kinds of trinkets, and there's some splendid violins here made with nothing but a pocket knife, so we can have music, dance, and kill time.
Although the privilege of purchasing goods was not always available, at times prisoners could buy smoked beef, cornmeal, apples, lemons, stationery pens, stamps, scissors, and other items from the sutler, Albert Dart, who paid a 5% commission on sales to the prison fund. Dart, a part owner of a grocery store in the city of Rock Island, would drive his wagon across the bridge, accompanied by his faithful bulldog, then into the center of the prison compound and do a brisk business, which sometimes brought in over $5,000 a month. While some prisoners wrote home for money, others asked kinfolk to communicate directly with Mrs. Charles Buford, who, although a close relative of a Union Major General, was thought of as an angel by the prisoners. Confederate prisoner William Wall wrote home,
"If you would send to Mrs. Charles Buford of Rock Island City $5, she would get me a hat, and you would save express charges beside, which would amount to something. Mrs. B frequently does such acts of kindness and is a kind-hearted Christian lady."
Prisoners could have their pictures taken by the local photographer, Josh Smith, whose photo gallery was set up on the prison grounds. Prisoner William Wall wrote home to his family,
"I see from my front door that the Yankees have put up a picture gallery just outside of the fence, and understand that the Rebs will be permitted to patronize it. Hundreds of boys will avail themselves of the opportunity, and I would like to send home some pictures myself."
Nonetheless, with thousands of prisoners under confinement, all was not peaceful, and lapses in discipline were common. One punishment for stealing from a fellow prisoner was riding Morgan's mule. The guilty party was forced to sit on a 1-inch wide plank for a number of hours. During the 20 months while the Rock Island prison was operational, 4 different Union regiments were assigned the task of guarding the prisoners, beginning with the Invalid Corps. They soon were replaced by the 37th Iowa, a regiment of senior citizens commonly called the Graybeards. Most members of this regiment were over the age of 50, and some were older than 70. The Graybeards were mustered into service at Camp Strong near Muscatine, Iowa, just 30 miles downriver from Rock Island. On the 19th of January, 1864, the Graybeards arrived at the Rock Island train station, but Colonel Johnson had no quarters for them on the island. It was February before they could take up residence there, and when they did, it took 2 days to move all their accumulated furniture, including bedsteads and rocking chairs. They were accompanied by their laundresses and by livestock, including cows, sheep, goats, and chickens. Colonel Johnson developed a dislike for both their performance and their entourage. He was happy to see the Graybeards reassigned in June of 1864 to Memphis, Tennessee, where they would serve as railway guards. They were replaced by the 133rd Illinois, known as a 100-day regiment, for their short-term assignment. This regiment was so undisciplined and so reckless in their behavior that their colonel, Thaddeus Phillips, was obliged to write letters of apology to numerous towns the 133rd had passed through from Springfield to Rock Island. On September 24th of that year, the 108th Infantry United States Colored Troops arrived at Rock Island to relieve the 133rd Illinois, whose enlistments had expired. This regiment of former slaves from Kentucky immediately caused